Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you here for the Ciena webinar. We are excited to have our friends from Tenney Group back today. We are going to be talking about the 7 best practices for succession planning. It's obviously a big issue for a lot of companies, and one that probably might not get talked about until it's a little too late. So with that, I'd like to welcome back Spencer and Eric from Tenney Group. Spencer is the president and CEO, and Eric is the managing director. And they've got a great history of helping people in our industry with their business in a lot of different angles. But today we're talking about succession planning. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Eric and let him talk a little bit about Tenney Group, kind of what they do, and then we're going to jump right in. So with that, gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Hal. Again, as always, great to be with you guys, and happy to support in any way we can. So we are an M&A firm that works 100% in transportation and logistics for 48, what is it now? It doesn't matter. 48 years, almost 50 years, transportation only, mergers and acquisition advisory services. So we work squarely in the lower middle market, 20 to 300 million revenue companies. The vast majority of our clients are family-owned, first generation, second generation, fourth generation companies. So that's why this topic is so important to the overall work that we do, is we've seen how families and companies that take this seriously and do it in the appropriate amount of energy and time are successful, and those that fail to do it hit bigger challenges than others. And so one of the things is, it's so important, as if this year's taught us anything, it's how important the supply chain is to our nation and how important transportation logistics are within the supply chain. And just like the supply chain, when there's a disruption, there are ripple effects. And if there is a disruption to the operation due to a lack of a succession planning, and there are things that happen, there are ripple effects to the value of your business, as well as the operational effectiveness, and so on and so forth. So that is a main driver to why we do what we do in this next 45 minutes to an hour. Another component to it is that Spencer and I have done this talk 100 times, 200 times. I don't even know, Spencer. We were talking about it earlier this week, and we were talking about how it's really important to us, because Spencer and our firm is really a product of what we're about to talk through. And it reminded me of an old Hair Club for Men commercial where the guy comes on and says, "I'm not just the president, I'm also a client." So in this, throughout now, you have that to look forward to with Spencer. He's not just the president; he's also represents the fruit of these 7 basic steps to successful succession planning. So with that charming introduction, Spencer, why don't you take us into the first part of this?
I'm glad that there's not another camera that's a bird's eye view to check out my Hair Club for Men situation back here as well. But thank you for that. Just for our purposes, when we talk about succession planning, just for today, because that can be thrown around. When we talk about succession planning, let's start with the definition. We're talking about the preparation to maximize both the efficiency and the effectiveness of a transfer of ownership, whether that's inside a family or to an outside party. That's our definition for today. And I think that will kind of provide a little context for how we use these best practices. So here's the deal. We're all going to transfer ownership of our business at some point or another, some by force, some by choice. Some of us right now have a vision, an idea, to transition that to a family member. Some of it's to our employees through an ESOP. Could be to a strategic buyer to maximize everything that you have. And you have a plan for that perhaps. But here's the deal. Life happens and plans change. And so for many folks, statistically, that's why well over 60, we think somewhere like 80% of folks are not actively succession planning, because they don't see the point in it, because life's always changing. So why invest so much in a specific plan when life changes overnight? This is why this is important, because in the absence of succession planning, some pretty significant things happen. Number one, it's a major problem. And what happens as a result of that is that if you're not developing successors, you're developing high owner dependence. And just as this slide says, when we have high dependence on the owner, we have high risk associated with transferring ownership. And when you have high risk, the direct correlation is a reduced business valuation. If you follow that arrow across the screen, when we have a reduced valuation, we really are handcuffed in terms of what our options are and how do we bless our family? How do we bless our employees? how do we maximize the fruit of all that we've invested in this business? And so what we're trying to focus on today is the inverse of that, because if you don't get anything out of this presentation, it's like the solution to your future, it's not in a plan, it's in a process. And what we've outlined it's 7 best practices executed in a specific sequence over and over again. And when you love this process, eventually it will love you back. And here's how. Because as you develop more successors, you're de-risking the business. You're going to have much more opportunities to bless, to navigate the business, to give them growth opportunities. You're going to have much more opportunities to look at ways to care for your family through an exit, but also to select who's going to be the next trustee of the business moving forward and carry on that legacy. And that's what we want for you. So everything that we're going to be doing today is about loving a process that gives you options and more control to promote the interest of everyone around you. So I hope you're excited about it. So that's what we're going to be doing there. So with that, let's start with the very first practice there, sir.
Yeah. So again, reiterating, we're going to say this at least 10 times, if not more, focusing on a process, not on a plan. And so the first step in the process is establishing where you are. We feel like that one of the most critical components of a first stepping stone is to understand what your business is. We have found that is most effectively done by an objective third party. So we all have lots of ideas about what our homes are worth or how smart our kids are. We may or may not be accurate in those assessments, but the same thing goes for our businesses. Unfortunately, we may need some eyes on it that can see things that we can't see. So we believe that you're starting with a firm foundation by getting a third party objectively to help you understand and assess where your business is and what it's worth. And we believe that, and I haven't seen who's on right now, but I guarantee you there are a host of industry advisors that we lean on, from everything from accounting to legal to insurance, and the list goes on. And so finding people that are subject matter experts, industry experts, and valuation experts is a critical component to that. So that is a critical starting place. And once we get past that, and I'll be honest, a lot of people do that for different reasons. So that's one that kind of 90% of the people on are like, well, of course, that makes sense. The next one may not make as much sense. So Spencer, why don't you talk to us about what you see in step 2?
Once we've established a baseline for the value of the business, then we can start building on that. And so the step number 2, this is a little less intuitive for business owners. And this involves sharing the value of the business with family members or potential successors. And your first reaction might be, there's no way I'm doing that. And I get it. But here's why we do that. Family businesses in particular, they might go a decade or 2 without having a substantive conversation about what we want from the business. And so by educating business owners about, in the family and whoever might have an interest in the future about what it's worth today, you're able to do a couple different things. Number one, what we're really trying to do is identify who is someone who's interested in being a successor, because I think there's a tremendous amount of false assumptions made about what the next generation actually wants from the business. So we're using this as an instrument to smoke out who really wants to be a part of this. It doesn't mean that they're invited, but who actually wants to be invited. That's step 1. The next part is educating and equipping potential successors, because the business valuation is the instrument from which you can start educating about what drives business value. Because if you're not educating business or potential successors about what drives value, then you're setting them up to fail. They have to understand how to drive business value in order to be a legitimate successor to the business. And then that third thing, assigning key people to move the needle. Once they understand what moves needle, then you can assign some ownership over that particular part of the business so that they have some responsibility to do that. And you can see what's happening here is through this process, they're getting integrated into understanding and feeling the weight of ownership. The worst thing that you could do for someone is to not allow them, is to just dump the full burden of ownership on somebody without them actually feeling it before understanding or appreciating it. It's setting them up to fail. So by doing this, we're preparing successors, but they're also preparing successors for the future, but we're also providing immediate impact for the value of the business. And then the ultimate deal is that this is forcing owner displacement. So irrespective of who potentially is the successor, you're just by this process, you're adding value to the business because you're de-risking it by removing its dependence on you. So this is one of the most overlooked steps, and one of the biggest upsides for getting other folks involved in driving and creating value. Quick case study. We had a client of ours, independently wealthy. He wanted to go, thought he wanted to sell in about 5 years, had a very specific goal about what he wanted to do. His main desire, he wanted one of his 2 children to take over the business. So he set up a management trainee program, and we assisted in this, but ultimately over a 2-year period, they got financial experience, sales experience, safety, management. They got a little bit of taste of everything as part of equipping them. And of course, they were getting looped in on annual valuation refreshes that we were providing them. Year 1, the son, who was about 28 at the time, he said, "Hey, Dad, I'm out. I'm going to go play the blues with my band and my buddies, and I'm out." And he said, "Well, that's not a shocker. I kind of saw that coming." Now, his daughter, that was a different story. She was an absolute rock star. She was probably about 27 at the time, and just did everything better than he had ever done it before. But one day, he's sitting over there, as fathers notice, she's not herself. She says, "Sweetie, what's the deal?" He says, "Dad, I've learned more in the last 2 years than I've ever learned in my life. This is probably the most important lesson. I understand how important passion is to be successful in trucking. And listen, I've impacted the business and created value because I love you, but I don't love the business the way you love the business. And for that reason, I don't think that I want to be I don't want to be considered as a successor anymore." And in that moment, the father was a little bit disappointed, but also so proud and also so validated. He went through, he did everything that he could. He equipped, he made his daughter better for the encounter of the training. She's now equipped to go be a CEO of some kind, or a business owner of some kind. But now he has, he also did what he needed to do to make his business more valuable so that he could accomplish his exit goals. So it's just an excellent little insight, a little example of what that little step does when you make a point to connect, educate, and equip your potential successors to elevate the value of the business.
All right. That really highlights the next one, which is setting goals, right? And a lot of business owners do this for a lot of components of business. But in this sequence, it doesn't happen very often, of what we found in getting the value, having conversations with key shareholders, family members, successors, whatever that may be, and then establishing the goals of what the family needs, what the ownership needs, and what the next generation or the successors need in the process. So that obviously you're identifying what does the family need for financial security? What does Gen 1 or Gen 2 that needs to get out require in order to be able to retire or go and take the next chapter? Spencer mentioned setting goals for the next opportunities for the next generation or whoever is the successors. And then really setting goals for the company. And for us, a lot of our clients represent significant influences in their community. So we encourage owners to take all of those components into consideration when you're setting goals, because the decisions you make have the ripple effects of not just you and your spouse, or you and your shareholders, or you and your kids and your family, and so on and so forth, but the ripple effects of the community. So setting goals allows you to get out in front of yourself of what you're planning to do, what you want to do, and really setting markers for whether you're going to be successful in reaching those goals. Once you have the goals, you go to step 4, which again is a little bit not always intuitive, but one that we find successful. Spencer?
Right. And so you should expect there to be a gap between where you are and where you want to be. So the key question is, all right, let's quantify what that gap is. And for some people that is, well, I want my son to run this business. The gap is it's an equipping gap. He's not ready. He doesn't have those things in place. So that's we need to define what that is. And some of it's the business it can't command enough value in the marketplace. So what it does, by defining that gap, it helps us to understand what we can do to go close that gap. And so there's some things that we have to consider as a part of every process about what instruments are available to us to go close the gap when we're trying to improve a future outcome. So there's 4 things here. And if we can clip through these things, Eric, the first one's time. And then if we can just kind of keep them going here, the first one's time, next one's capital, The next one is appetite for risk. And the last one is just energy. Because as you can appreciate, I hear it all the time. I said, man, if I was 20 years younger, I would be mopping the floor with the competition right now based on what I know. And so there's a different risk profile. There's a different energy level depending on what season of life you're in. That dictates how you go about closing valuation gaps. So here's an example of that with a case study that we were working with a father and son, great relationship. They had been doing valuations for us a while, had a very specific plan to build value so that they could keep the business within the family, but also satisfy the one non-negotiable, which was financial security for the family. The business owner's wife had some health issues. This was his entire source of retirement. So very clear communication. This is the path. This is the gap. This is what we got to close. Here's the non-negotiable in terms of outcomes. Go. So they're moving right along, and the son is just doing wonderfully as far as building, getting more experience, building value. But as you can see in the picture, what happens? Life happens. And so goes into to the doctor because he's not feeling well. And the doctor basically says, if you don't get out of this business, change your lifestyle dramatically, not only you're not going to have a business, you're not going to be alive. And so it was a quick pivot in terms of, well, hey, what can we do to try to sell the business or have the son go get third-party financing to go get this deal done? Which he could, but it wasn't enough. I mean, it was not going to be enough to sustain the family financially from a security standpoint. So that's when we went through the time, capital, risk, and energy. And like, what do we have? Well, based on his health condition, we didn't have any of those things. The only thing that we could really do to satisfy that goal was to go to the open market. Now, here's where families can come together and help one another. Based on its standalone fair market value, it wasn't going to attract enough proceeds to satisfy the financial security goal. However, through a synergistic type strategic buyer, we could probably get there. And here's how we did this in terms of deal structuring. The father and son came together and helped de-risk the business by signing a 5-year employment agreement with the buyer. So the son stayed on, and the buyer's like, well, hey, if he has all the relationships and he's going to give me that type of commitment, I can pay a little more money. And that also allowed the owner to provide a reward and a bonus to the son, although it wasn't the business, but it was a pretty significant cash bonus upon delivering the support required as part of the transaction. So I think this is the whole theme. It's a process. We had to pivot, but it's a great example of we define a gap, we go through that, and we figure out what we can do. And the best part about the story is, I guarantee you, each Thanksgiving dinner, although they didn't get the outcome that they had preferred, they're a very blessed and happy and together family.
I think that illustrates, again, the point that this is a process. It's not a plan. Some people, when you ask somebody, do you have a succession plan? If they 50% of the time when they say yes, they mean they have a 10-page document that they created back in the 80s that's somewhere in a file cabinet. That's not a succession plan. In our definition, a succession plan is something that's very agile and it's really process-based. So we can do what we're going to talk about at the end, which is constantly update. And sometimes those updates happen because macro events or external events impact us in a way that we can't control, like Spencer talked about. So one of the things we encourage clients to think about, and I would say pre-clients to think about, because the majority of people that we talk to on an annual basis don't ever hire us necessarily. But we have lots of conversations where we're trying to equip and educate owners to make good decisions. And one of those things is, are you considering all the available channels? Are you thinking critically about the available channels for transfer? Because many times we get tunnel vision. We only think about a handful of them. So here's a slide that just talks about some of the ones to consider. Obviously, employees. We have a client right now that we have a key employee that's looking to do what's called a management buyout. And so we're helping them process that versus other options. Number two, outside. That's the one that we most commonly think of is that I need to sell the business to someone who's not me or someone who's not in the business. 3 is a recap. Spencer mentioned that, going to a bank or some other financing component and asking them to create the liquidity for a transfer. The public market is one, obviously, we're all familiar with, that you can follow that channel. A co-owner, sometimes you have a minority stakeholder that wants to buy out the majority stakeholder. And then 6, that we've talked about a couple of times already, family members who have been in the business, given their blood, sweat, and tears, are waiting for their chance, their turn to take the reins. So those are just a few. And even within each of those 6, there are some nuances that we find ourselves going down through in the processes with clients. So that is just a high level 6 buckets that we would encourage you to think about. Similar to that slide, this is another slide I've found useful to talk to with business owners. And these numbers are not meant to be real numbers. They're meant to be purely for an example basis. But it's meant to show that with each different channel, there are different methodologies of how you go through that channel, as well as different financial outcomes. And what's not represented here is, in addition to different financial outcomes, there are different family member benefit outcomes with all of them. And one of the ones that's the easiest to give an example of is ESOP, right? And ESOP is an exit channel, an employee stock ownership plan. That's where an owner transfers 100% of the business, or even a portion of the business, to the employees. And so there's a financial benefit, but there's also a benefit for owners to say, well, I gave part of my business ownership to my employees that helped me build it. That is a very unique and a very successful channel, but it's not for everybody. It's not for as many people as we may think, but it's one that needs to be very critically examined before you pursue it. And we have some great resources that we work with to do that with clients very specifically. But I'll start at the top. Liquidation, purely just selling trucks and trailers or real estate or whatever the assets may be, chassis that you have. And so that's a pure, we're just selling assets. And that tends to be the lowest dollar amount. Management buyout, I mentioned earlier, many times when an employee is buying out an owner will extend a decreased valuation in order to allow them to get over that hurdle easier. Many times with that, there's also a substantial seller note where the owner is taking on the risk that the employee is going to be successful. So there's a component, again, there are value repercussions, but then there are also non-financial repercussions that have to be examined in each of these channels. ESOPs, I talked about. Equity recap, I just mentioned, where you're using liquidity from some other source to recapitalize the business. A negotiated option is one where you find company A and company B have known each other for a long time. They've said, hey, when you retire, I'd love to buy you. They come to an agreed upon price, and there's a transition that way. And we've seen in this industry that happen from time to time pretty successfully. We also see it not be successful. Just because someone's a really good operator of a trucking or transportation business doesn't necessarily mean they're good at merging 2 of them. So that's, again, non-financial repercussions to be examined through the process. An auction channel, I actually hate that word, even though that's pretty much what we do as a firm, because auction has a connotation of it's hard to sell, so we're going to auction it, versus, in our opinion, again, this is why our company is built this way, it's the most strategic because we're trying to find the most well-positioned buyer and seller and put them together. And you can't always do that on a one-on-one basis. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And so we hope that drives a little bit more synergistic value because you're putting together the best. I've said this in another, maybe in the first webinar, they all run together. I apologize, but the best M&A happens when a buyer's needs are met by a seller and a seller's needs are met by a buyer. And so when both sides of the table have both the financial needs met, but also the non-financial needs are met in that transition. And then, of course, the public option is not available to most folks, depending on the size, especially folks we work with in the middle market, but it's definitely a channel that folks have chosen. So that is a high level overview of what we would encourage folks to consider through this process and in the conversations with family members or successors. Is making sure that everybody is educated. And we had a case where we were actually in this process with a client several years ago and had done all of these steps, and we were on like valuation refresh number 3. After valuation number 1, the owner had identified his daughter again as just a rock star at running the business, had given her more and more responsibility. She taken the reins and fulfilled all of those responsibilities and more, and was really set up well to be successful. But as we went through this exercise and the updated valuation and identified all these different exit channels, she actually said, hey, this is a significant 90+% of our family's net worth. And I would feel more comfortable if we pursued some of these other options so that I'm not 100% responsible for 90% of our family's net worth. And so it caused us to pivot our plan, which was easy to do because it's a process, it's not a document. And they're to this day still in the process of figuring out what are all the right next steps. The business continues to be healthy. The relationships continue to be healthy. It continues to be a thriving business and community because of that. But making sure that all the players in this plan are educated and equipped to make good decisions is a critical component to this being successful. So, Spencer, help us think about what is next.
So I mentioned early on about like the way it works is when, we rinse and repeat, we do it over and over again. And the reason is this is because values change, goals change, life changes overnight. And so even in that same scenario that Eric just described, where 1 year you have literally everybody saying, this is the exit channel. We're going to go with Janice and she has all the talent but the next year we're having a very different conversation because she doesn't want that weight anymore. So now we're talking about, we can't go strategic because the strategic will make this operation and this location obsolete because it's not necessary. So we'll lose all those jobs in our town. So what we really need is a private equity group that just wants to keep it the way it is and fund and recap. So for that reason, at our direction is like, well, if that's what you want that specific exit channel. And now that we're doing this refresh, well, we need to start developing some relationships because that's a little bit more of a process of dating. It's a partner. I mean, it's no longer necessarily just an all-out buyout. Like you're going to be working with these people collaboratively. So the relationship is key, and we need some time to nurture that. So it's a great that's why we do this on an annual basis, because as those goals change, then we have new objectives and things that we have to go address in order to go execute the next best plan that's available to us. And as part of that, again, we're extracting information from our potential accessors. We're continuing to equip them to drive business value. And we're adapting to the things that we can't control around us. And so on an annual basis, when it's scheduled, all you're doing is multiplying your options and staying ahead of the curve. So, which none of this really can happen unless we do step 7, which is really kind of step 1. We start to act, and it's act and be a hero. And Eric mentioned my family and my dad and I were business partners for a long time. I bought him out about 3 years ago. And so we talk about living it out. We're a proof of the product. Well, my dad and I, we went through all these steps, and there were certainly times through a 20-year period where I was very interested in acquiring the business. And then I might've gone through a season where I wasn't interested in acquiring the business. Ultimately, I bought him out in 2018. He is probably the healthiest 70+ person I've ever known. We didn't have to do anything. We just knew that it was the right time to do it as part of setting up the business to be successful. After we had closed on that transaction, 4 months later, he's in a very significant motorcycle accident, about breaks his back, and he's incapacitated for about 6 months. So you can imagine, had we not taken care of business on the front end, it's one thing to have talent, whatever, but if I didn't have control and I was in a web of family and all this nonsense to try to do things, who's hurt most by that? It's the employees, it's the customers, it's everyone that's associated with your business. They're the ones that take the brunt of it. And so because we had prepared and we had executed, I was able to do what was required to move on. People stepped up and we moved right along. And now he's back and he's working deals and doing whatever he wants to do. But it's a great lens into like, why do you do this? Why do you proactively do this as opposed to doing what many of your peers would do, is just react to the circumstances? It's because the reactive approach doesn't empower you. And that's what we want for all of our peers in the trucking industry. Be empowered, be out in front, be in control. And when you do that, just like this slide says, that's when you become a hero. That's when you are going above and beyond to protect the interest and promote the interest of your employees, your community, and your customers. And that's a big deal. So, Eric, why don't you just run us through here, just a quick recap for everybody.
Yeah, again, for the 15th time, as promised, this is a plan and a process, not a plan and a document. And so it really needs to be an illustration in a circle. Spencer, actually, note to self, we ought to put this in a circle where 7 and 1 butt up against each other, because it is true that 7 leads to 1, and then 1 goes all the way back through the circle and leads back to constantly you as a business owner constantly calling on yourself to be a hero in a way where maybe no one recognizes you to be a hero. Again, this year has taught us anything. Frontline workers and the people that were heroes were some of the folks that, the drivers and the folks that were working to do things that most of the time we as Americans had not paid attention to. So that in this context, that's the business owner a lot of times being the hero. Number one, establish where you are. Get some objective third-party eyes to help you understand that. Number 2, have that conversation with the parties that are going to be impacted. So successors and other shareholders, stakeholders, making sure that the future plans are based on a very mature and clear understanding of where you are. Number 3, from there, establish goals and create an ownership transfer goal. Identify and quantify the gaps. So ultimately, there's going to be somewhere that there's going to need work. So identifying the gaps, working toward the goals as you identify and staff those gaps, fill those gaps. Consider all your available exit channels, both the financial repercussions as well as the non-financial repercussions to those channels, and rinse and repeat. We encourage annually, and we encourage involving advisors as well as other stakeholders and shareholders involved in that rinse and repeat process. And again, all day, every day, being a hero by the actions that you take to provide for your family, for your customers, for your people, for your community. All those things you do day in and day out as a business owner, you're doing in this process as well. And so we'd encourage you to continue that. So that is the end of our content. Hal, if you want to take us in any direction Q&A wise, we're happy to do that.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, gentlemen, thank you very much. That was great. People can't underestimate that human touch component of this and how people really need to work through it, because I think you touched on it in a couple cases. Just because there's an expectation of sort of handing it off to people in the family, that may not work, and they may not want it, or they may not be capable of handling it, or there might be multiple people that you're going to have to kind of work through. We've got some good questions here, and one we'll kick in because I think it's a nice pivot to the Q&A portion. Is, fundamentally, would you say that your 7 practices, this sort of the cyclical process, is it best applied to specific types of industries, or do you think that this could be laid across multiple industries?
That's a great question. And what I know to be true, my answer is twofold. We know it's highly effective in the transportation logistics space because we've seen it over decades. We know it, hearing it from other people, but prior to me working with Tenney Group, I was a wealth advisor with a regional bank, and we utilized these same principles with our clients who were bank clients who were in every industry. And so, candidly, part of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing now is because we would have these conversations and encourage clients to do this type of work. And the position I was in, the organization I was in, was not able to actually help them activate on that. And so part of what energizes me and what I get to do day in and day out is I know the power of this content, but then I also get to help people plug in with my team, activate on it, and see the fruits of this process lived all the way out, and then be able to get a text from them on Christmas Day, celebrating the work that we got to do together. So the short answer, I'm not really good at short answers, but the short answer is that, yes, this is applicable to any size company, any industry, without a doubt, it is applicable.
Great. Yeah. And I think it was a great question, and I think a very logical answer. I mean, I know that across the board, amongst IANA members, there are a lot of companies that fall into this category because there's a heck of a lot of entrepreneurs in intermodal. They start these businesses and they may have plans when they start, but frequently it's to run my business and serve my customers and build success, but it may not translate into, and what does that mean when I can't do this or don't want to do this or I'm not able to do this anymore?
Hey, Hal, we had a client late last year. We were talking about his process and just recapping, and he said, I'd always heard that you really needed to start 20 years before anything needed to happen. And unfortunately for me, I started 19 years too late, but ultimately we came out on top. And so I think he was just saying, as someone who successfully went through the process, he realizes how much work he could have done leading up to that to make that the overall process even more successful. So
now that makes sense. And that's a great segue. Is there an ideal time to start the process, getting the wheels in motion?
My favorite answer is yesterday. The ideal time is when you're willing to make the time, carve it out, and take it seriously, because it's not something to half-heartedly do, because that can create even more misunderstanding and even misguidance on the next generation of the successors. And so, making sure that it's handled, professionally and intentionally is the timing is now, whenever now is.
No, that makes. I sort of knew the answer, but I figured it makes sense, because it's worth emphasizing to people to don't put it off until you have to, because that's probably too late. Here's a good question. There is a tsunami of private equity looking for investment in the trucking industry. At what level of EBITDA are you seeing multiple expansion? Are asset light operations valued differently from asset-based carriers?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is
Spencer,
yes.
I've talked a lot. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, great question. I think that with a little nuance there, conceptually, yes, asset light for whatever reason does attract. I think because part of it is when people are investing, the main driver's potential for growth. And so if the capital expenditures associated with that growth are tremendously lower on the asset light side, then that's going to help expand valuation ranges that people can consider as part of that proposition. On the asset heavy, there are some limitations there, because for every $100,000 or a couple $100,000 of new revenue, you have to start adding more debt to the balance sheet to go execute on that. And so I think that's the relationship between asset heavy and asset light. But without question, within our firm, there's a significant amount of interest with private equity right now, largely because of just fragmentation and the opportunity associated with that. So yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're at right now, and that's a little bit of where we're going in terms of the value differentiations for both different types of businesses.
Kind of riffing on valuation a little bit. What are some of the things that can go wrong when you're sharing valuation information with family members who work in the business?
I'll take that. So, no, obviously, and again, I think this is why this is part of the process. I'm reminded of a story where we had a client, and he was asking me about it. I was like, well, he was concerned, like, hey, I don't want to communicate. I know what the value of my business is. I don't want to tell my son, because I know that what that's going to tell him is that he can't afford to buy it. And that's going to create a divide in our family. And so what we did as an alternative is like, well, look, you should not be in that position. You should have a third party communicating that, because what we're trying to do is disarm. I mean, it is what it is. This is the value of the business. I would love for you to have it. If you don't have the means to do that, then it's a very non-emotionally charged type conversation. Like, this is what it is. Can we make a deal here? No, we can't. It's not reasonable to ask the founders to make unrealistic concessions on value if they're trying to do something. So if you have a third party involved, well, I'll say to answer the question, if you don't have a third party involved, that's what can go wrong. I mean, you can really upset and create some division within a family because there's no context from which to appreciate that. It can be perceived as like, no, you're just trying to, like, you don't want me to have it. And I'm like, well, that's not, I just want to get what's fair. That's it. And so this third party telling us what's fair. I want to work with you. I don't have to have exactly that, but if there's a path to make that happen, what I'm not going to do is have me and your mom finance this thing over 30 years and hope that you're successful. Like, I'm not doing that. And so I think that the idea is if you don't have some arm's length distance as part of communicating that, that's where you can have some problems.
Well, and I think, again, having speculative conversations as opposed to professional and objective conversations. I had a conversation probably 3 years ago now with a family-owned business, and they had a handful of conversations with other people that had sold their businesses. They took that, cocktail hour conversation and overlaid it on what they assumed to be pretty fair valuation of their business. And then it spent 2 years talking about how they were going to spend all their money. And once we got in a conversation, we said, well, here's what I think it's worth. It was about a third of what they had been speculating. And so now you've got 13 family members that had already put contracts on beach houses. That's not true. But in their mind, they had, because they've been speculating something that's just not true. So that's another example of how it can go wrong.
You touched on something there, is that the real critical risk that you run if you're operating in a vacuum. And if you don't seek professional help that gives you, independent third party expertise. And it isn't just your neighbor who used to have a contracting business and they sold their contracting business or whatever. Speaking of mistakes, what's an expensive mistake that a business owner could easily avoid when working through the process of succession planning?
Well, I think the one that I see most commonly is well-intentioned business owners that, again, are getting counsel, that are trying to get out in front of a potential problem. And a specific example, a trucking company came to me about 80 million in annual revenue, and 4 brothers started the business. Combined between them, they had about 15 next gen folks. And so they literally spent about $250,000 drafting these elaborate trust and estate planning type deals without even, and so my question was, I was like, have you asked them if they actually want the business? Because that's pretty material at this point, based on how far you're into this from a professional fee standpoint. And he said, no, I just kind of assumed that this was their dream. And I was like, they may actually want to do it. And this is what the problem is. It's like, but it's not without conditions. I want the business. If it's mine, if I control it, I'm not running it with my cousin. I'm not running it with whoever else. It's like, these are the only conditions under which I would do it. And I think those are the most expensive and avoidable mistakes that people can do, is just, hey, have a authentic conversation about what you really want from the business and what your family wants from the business before drafting up those documents. And you might save $250,000 just right there, just by finding out that, hey, the conditions under which that person wants to be a successor or considered a successor are not going to be available. And so move on.
Yeah. Actually, a question just came in kind of riffing on that about families that are experiencing internal feuds, is the term they use. Is there a way that you guys approach working with families that might have drastically different opinions?
Yeah, we find that to be true, whether they're family members or not. You have ownership interests that have dramatically different viewpoints. And Spencer touched on them with the 4 components that you have to evaluate. If you've got a 40-year-old and you've got a 70-year-old, they have very different risk tolerances, right? And so it's not just opinions, it's stage of life. It's the reality. If someone else had sold a business prior to starting this one and one hadn't, and then one really needs more liquidity out of the sale than the other one does. And so I think that, when you add the family component, it does add another level of complexity, because as Spencer said, You still have to, well, in theory, have to have Thanksgiving dinner together. But, but we generally handle it like their ownership stakes. And we're trying to help them identify what are the key goals, what are the key needs. And so trying to eliminate some of the opinion-based or subjective and say, okay, well, objectively, let's talk about objective. And Spencer just mentioned it. Here's what it is. The company is only worth $100 million and there's 50 family members. So, you figure out how to split the pie up, right? So that's not necessarily true exactly how we would do it, but the idea is trying to get it objective. Oh, here's what's true, and identifying goals and needs from the different parties. And we've done it in a number of different ways of trying to help them navigate it objectively to get to an outcome that meets the needs of the different parties. But I think that's one of the critical things is evaluating it from hey, it's understandable that different parties have different energy, risk, capital, time components to how they're evaluating this process.
Hey, Hal, the other thing that I would just add, and this kind of hits home for me because this is pretty autobiographical for me, where it's you have a different vision for the business if you have different age, different outlook, or whatever it is. And so as we're trying to serve clients, what we're really trying to do is help them get their goals in alignment. Because ultimately what happens when you don't have the family or the business partners, you don't have their goals in alignment, the business is going to stagnate because it can't go anywhere. You can't make any decisions. And this is the type of industry where you have to be all in all the time or you're going to lose. And so we have to kind of untangle what is preventing them from getting their goals in alignment. And again, kind of back to what Eric was talking about, people don't consider all the different exit channels. People don't understand or consider all the different ways that they could probably get their goals in alignment. And it doesn't mean that they have to sell the business. Like for me, in my example, although I did buy the business, I didn't necessarily need to buy the business. I just wanted controlling interest to go execute strategy that I knew needed to get done. And I think that like when people and business partners and families, if they're opening up the conversation and the goal is like, how can we get our goals in alignment? That is the foundation from which some things can actually get done. Because if there's an open mind, there's a lot of different means to help execute and facilitate that. But that's the starting place.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think just something that keeps coming up is you guys have to be, MBAs and Masters of Social Work to be able to kind of negotiate the pure business arc and the pure sort of human condition arc that are intertwined in a lot of these realities. So I'm glad you guys are out there to help people because it gets pretty interesting. I think we're coming up on the end, but I do want to loop back to one thing that you guys said that I really focused in on, and it's love in the process. And it's how will I know when the process of succession planning is beginning to love me back? Like how do you like when do you what are some of the key things that let me know this is working?
Well, I think the number one thing, probably the earliest one will be just the recognition that you're not putting out as many fires as you are accustomed to putting out, because you're developing some successors that have authority to handle some of that stuff. So I think and from a mindset, you'll know that the process is loving you when you're starting to elevate your mindset about how you think about doing business and building value in this space. Because until you are developing those successors and submitting that authority to them to actually let them go do some things, you're not going to get your head above water enough to really appreciate what's going on. But I want to encourage the folks, like that's a lot easier to execute than what you think. And the reason why is you can control it. That's the one thing that you can control as far as letting go. And once you start doing that, and I'm not saying that that's an easy thing at all, but that's the thing that you can control. And once you start doing that, things start to change from a value standpoint, from the way that you see the future, and the way that you relate to the people within your business. And so I think that is the first indication that you're on the right track. And my encouragement to you is as you start experiencing that, it'll be something that you can't get enough of, and then you'll continue to build off of that.
Now that's great wisdom. That sort of approach of we versus me makes so much sense. And you mentioned your dad and his experience with this motorcycle, and that's a horrible story, but I'm glad he's doing well now. But there is that reality of driving of any vehicle, that notion of death grip, right? Like the problem happens when you're holding on to the wheel too tightly. Once you get that modulation, so you're holding it, but you're not squeezing the life out of it. The machine performs better, and I think that makes sense in terms of what you just said about, these indicators are telling me that this is working, because I'm starting to see this evolution, as opposed to just it's me. I got to do all this. I got to carry everybody on my back. Well, gents, that was great. I really enjoyed that. It was a lot of information, and I really appreciate you kind of walking folks through those 7 steps to really kind of get your house in order. And also the insights of those case studies were terrific, because I think they really put some great perspective on what really happens when people go through this process. I would really like to thank you guys for sponsoring today. If folks would like more information about IANA or some of our other programs, please head on over to intermodal.org and check out what we've got going on there. And if you'd like to contact our friends at Tenney Group, please do. We appreciate them sponsoring this session and bringing this really just incredibly insightful wisdom to the business community today. So with that, we want to say thank you to Spencer and Eric, and to all of you folks out there for joining us. Stay safe, be vigilant, and hopefully we will see you all in person soon. Thank you.